on the coldest day of the year and stumbled upon an abandoned tent in the endless snow. But what he found inside shattered everything he thought he knew about what this park is really hiding. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Winter had sealed Denali like a tomb. The park no longer looked like a place on any map, but like a vast blank left behind when the world had finished writing itself. For 7 days the storm had not lifted, not even long enough for the mountains to show their shoulders. Wind drove needles of ice sideways across the flats, and the temperature had fallen to levels that drained meaning from words like cold. This was not a season. It was a condition. It crawled into steel, into plastic, into bone, and claimed everything that lingered too long. The Stampede Trail had been closed for nearly 2 months, its gate locked with a red tag that warned of fatal exposure and zero response time. Even the snowmobiles of the winter cruise no longer ran that deep. Too many whiteouts, too many dead batteries, too many radios that went silent. The last time the trail had been opened in January, a pair of contractors had taken 12 hours to reach a ranger outpost less than 20 miles from the road. They survived only because the wind buried them in snow that insulated their broken truck just enough to keep their blood from freezing. The report called it an anomaly. Lamar Hill called it a warning. He had been working the winter detail for almost 9 years, long enough to understand that Denali did not operate by exception. It operated by erasure. It erased landmarks. It erased plans. It erased people. You learned quickly not to argue with it. You learned to read the way drifts settled against the trunks of black spruce and how the ridgeline of a buried creek could still be traced by the way the wind bent the snow into a pale spine across the flats. Lamar had learned these things because once he had not known them, and the memory of that ignorance had nearly killed someone. The radio crackled in the patrol cabin just after dusk, the weak solar lamps above the desk flickering as the generator strained against the cold. The signal was faint, nothing like the clean emergency pings that usually cut through the static. It sounded more like the afterimage of a signal, a ghost of a transmission that had already decided not to be heard. Dispatch tried to repeat the coordinates twice. Both times the words dissolved into white noise. When Lamar asked them to try again, there was a pause that lasted just long enough for him to imagine the person on the other end checking the weather feed and the duty roster and deciding that this one could wait. Then the voice came back, apologetic, uncertain. They had a sensor anomaly near the Teclanica Basin. It was probably a misfire. Ice on the contact, maybe. Those happened in these temperatures. They would flag it for daylight review. Lamar did not answer at first. He leaned back in his chair and let the cabin creak around him, the walls contracting as the cold tightened its grip. The Teclanica was not a tourist zone in winter. There were no scheduled patrols, no maintenance routes, no sanctioned traffic. If a beacon was transmitting from that sector, it meant one thing. Someone had been there who was not supposed to be. He told dispatch he was heading out. The response was immediate and predictable. They told him to wait, to follow protocol, to let the morning shift assess. He listened until the end, and then said he was going anyway. When the line went quiet, he stood and began to pack. The motions were automatic. Rope, flares, spare batteries wrapped in cloth and tucked inside the inner pockets of his parka so his body heat would keep them alive. He filled a thermos with something that tasted vaguely of coffee and poured another into a steel flask that had belonged to his father. He paused for a moment with the lid of his pack open, staring at the small photograph taped inside, the corners worn soft from years of handling. It was the only reminder he carried of the life he had abandoned when he came north. A life that had ended not with a clean break, but with a slow series of erasures that mirrored the land outside his door. When he stepped onto the porch, the wind hit him like a wall. The cabin's floodlight carved a narrow cone through the snow, and beyond it there was nothing. He locked the door behind him and took 3 slow breaths through the scarf that covered his face. The air burned his lungs, sharp and metallic, but it steadied him. He had learned long ago that panic in this place was not loud. It was quiet. It was a sudden urge to hurry. The first mile of the Stampede Trail was marked only by the way the trees leaned away from the prevailing wind, their lower branches stripped bare by decades of abrasion. Lamar followed that lean, his boots finding purchase in snow that shifted and sighed under his weight. Every sound was swallowed almost as soon as it was made. Even the storm seemed distant, as if the world were holding its breath. After half an hour, the last of the familiar markers vanished, and the trail dissolved into open country. He checked his compass and adjusted his bearing, feeling the subtle change in the texture of the ground beneath the drifts. Somewhere to his left, the Teclanica lay frozen under meters of ice, its summer violence reduced to a rumor of dark water moving far below. He was thinking about that when he felt it for the first time, a faint reverberation that traveled up through the soles of his boots and into his knees, like the echo of a hammer strike in a deep tunnel. He stopped and waited. The wind pushed at his shoulders, urging him to keep moving, but he stood still until the cold began to claw through his layers. The vibration came again, almost imperceptible, a hollow sensation that had no place in solid ground. Lamar frowned and took a cautious step forward. The snow under his weight compressed with a sound that was not quite right, a muted whump that suggested space where there should have been none. He marked the spot on his GPS, though he knew the coordinates might be useless by morning, and forced himself to move on. The storm closed around him, erasing his tracks almost as soon as they were made, and the feeling of being watched settled into his spine. He had no name for it, only the certainty that Denali had not finished revealing itself yet. The vibration Lamar had felt beneath the snow followed him long after he left the faint hollow behind. It was not a sound he could hear with his ears, not in the way the wind roared or the branches cracked under the weight of ice. It was something he sensed through his body, a low, unsettled presence that made the land feel thinner, as though the park itself were a shell and not the massive, immutable thing it pretended to be. He walked with his head lowered against the gale, counting his steps and checking his compass at regular intervals, forcing himself not to hurry even when the storm seemed to be hurting him forward. It took nearly an hour before the first dark shape broke through the whiteness. At first, he thought it was nothing more than a drift shadow, a trick of the light in the storm, but as he closed the distance, the shape resolved into fabric caught in a crouch beneath the weight of snow. He slowed, pulse quickening despite the cold that tried to steal it, and approached from the upwind side the way he had been trained. The smell reached him before the details did, a faint chemical tang of nylon and fuel that did not belong in the empty winter basin. The camp sat on the edge of the Teclanica, or what passed for its edge in January. The river itself was invisible, buried under layers of ice and snow that made the surface look like a frozen plain, but Lamar could feel the void beneath it in the way the ground changed underfoot. The tent was half collapsed, its frame bent and its fly sheet shredded into long pale ribbons that snapped in the wind. To one side, 2 backpacks stood upright in the lee of a drift, their straps neatly buckled, as if their owners had intended to come back for them after a short errand. He knelt and brushed snow from the top of one pack, his gloves stiff with ice. There was no sign of scavengers, no tearing or dragging. The food was still inside, sealed and intact. The stove lay on its side near a shallow pit that might once have been a fire, though it had long since been smothered by the storm. Nothing about the arrangement made sense. Even the most careless winter hiker would not leave gear standing in the open like this, not in a place where the wind could erase it in minutes. Lamar moved to the tent and ducked under the sagging flap. The interior was a cave of frost, every surface filmed with ice crystals that glowed faintly in the reflected beam of his headlamp. He reached out and touched the wall, feeling the brittle stiffness of frozen fabric, and then he saw the cut. It ran in a rough diagonal from shoulder height down to the floor, the edges jagged and curled outward. He traced it with one finger and felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The fabric had been sliced from the inside. He backed out slowly and circled the tent, looking for signs of a bear or a moose or any of the other explanations that might let him file this away as another tragic but ordinary accident. There were no tracks, no heavy prints crushed into the snow. He found a scrap of map wedged beneath a guy line, and its paper softened and blurred by moisture, and a headlamp that flickered once when he pressed the switch before dying completely. He called out, his voice swallowed as soon as it left his mouth, and waited. Nothing answered him but the wind. The ground beyond the tent bore the faintest impression of boots, a pattern so shallow it might have been imagined, leading away from the camp toward the river basin. He followed it on hands and knees, brushing snow aside with his forearms, trying to read the story in the faint depressions. 10 feet from the tent, the impressions ended abruptly. He scraped at the surface with his gloved fingers and felt the snow give way more easily than it should have, sinking a few inches with a dull, hollow sound that made his stomach tighten. He pressed his palm flat against the drift and closed his eyes. There it was again. The vibration, clearer this time, a subtle tremor that seemed to pulse up through the ice in a slow rhythm. The Teclanica was dead in winter. Its flow was a distant memory under meters of frozen silence. Yet, what he felt was not the settling of ice or the distant cracking of a glacier. It was something else, something that suggested depth where there should have been none. He forced himself to stand and shook the snow from his sleeves. The storm was worsening, the flakes thickening into a blinding curtain that reduced the world to a few shifting yards of gray. He needed to mark the site before he lost it. He drove 2 fluorescent flags into the drift at the edge of the camp and logged the coordinates, aware even as he did so that the markers might be buried or blown flat by morning. When he turned back toward the tent, his eye caught on a dark shape half hidden in the folds of torn fabric. It was a jacket, wedged between the collapsed poles, its hood crusted with ice. He tugged it free and checked the pockets by feel. His fingers closed around something hard and rectangular. He drew it out and held it up to the light, a small waterproof case the size of a deck of cards. Inside, protected by rubber seals, was a flash drive. For a long moment, he simply stood there, the storm tearing at him, the case warm against his palm in a way that felt wrong. This was not gear you left behind. This was not trash blown in from the road. This belonged to someone who had been here recently, someone who had thought enough to safeguard their data even as they fled whatever had driven them from their shelter. He slipped the flash drive into the inner pocket of his parka and took one last look around the camp. His training told him to stay, to search outward in widening arcs until he found a trace of the missing people, but the sky had other ideas. The light was failing, the wind rising to a pitch that made it difficult to stand upright, and the hollow places in the snow were becoming more numerous as he moved, patches where the crust dipped and sighed under his weight. If he stayed much longer, he would be adding his own name to the list of people who vanished in this park every year. The walk back to the patrol cabin was a blur of white and strain. Twice he stumbled and had to catch himself with his ice axe, the ground slumping alarmingly beneath him before it firmed again. The sensation of being watched returned, stronger now, as if something below the surface were aware of his presence and curious about it. By the time the dark outline of the cabin emerged from the storm, Lamar's muscles were trembling with fatigue, and the cold had begun to creep past the outer defenses of his gear. Inside, the air was barely above freezing, but it felt like summer after the emptiness outside. He peeled off his gloves and parka and stood in front of the heater until sensation returned to his fingers in painful waves. Only then did he pull the flash drive from his pocket and set it on the desk beside the radio. The small object looked absurdly harmless in the yellow lamplight, a piece of plastic and metal that could not possibly explain the broken tent, the vanished footprints, the tremor in the ice. Yet, as he dried his gear and typed the first lines of his report, Lamar could not shake the feeling that this tiny device was a door, and that once he opened it, there would be no closing what lay on the other side. The flash drive sat on the desk while the storm clawed at the walls of the patrol cabin, a small black rectangle that had no right to feel as heavy as it did. Lamar made coffee from water he had to chip out of a frozen jug and waited until the trembling in his hands eased before he connected it to the old laptop the park issued for winter patrols. The machine protested with a grinding hum as it woke, its battery already losing the fight against the cold despite the heater roaring in the corner. Outside, the wind rose and fell like something breathing. The first file opened slowly, the screen filling with digital noise before the image stabilized. A young man's face appeared, pale from cold and exhaustion, but still carrying the careless confidence of someone who believed the world would eventually yield to him. He smiled at the camera and introduced himself, his voice cracking with excitement, explaining that he and two friends were finally on the Stampede Trail, chasing what he called the real Denali, not the tourist version fenced off by rules and warnings. Behind him, through the tent flap, Lamar recognized the gray blur of snow that had not yet become the wall of death it was now. The next videos were more practical, shot in the shaky first-person style of someone who had grown tired of talking to himself. They showed campsites, maps spread across gloved hands, the Teclanica and summer photographs held up to the lens as a promise of what lay beneath the ice. The hikers talked about an old forum post they had found, a scrap of rumor from someone who claimed to have fallen through the crust near the Ruth Glacier years ago and glimpsed something impossible under the ice. They laughed about it at first, the way people laugh at legends when they are still warm and safe. By the fourth file, the tone had shifted. The light was different, colder, and the voices were lower, cautious. One of the women spoke about a sound they had heard in the night, a deep thudding that seemed to come from beneath their sleeping pads, as though the ground were hollow. The camera cut to the snow outside the tent, the lens catching a faint blue shimmer that made Lamar lean closer to the screen. It was subtle, barely more than a suggestion of color, but it moved, a slow tide of light that pulsed and faded in a rhythm too regular to be natural. His coffee went untouched as the story unfolded. They had followed the glow for half a mile in a whiteout, filming when the cold would allow, until they reached a depression in the snow that sounded wrong when they stamped on it. One of them had jabbed at the surface with a trekking pole, and the tip had vanished into nothing. The next clip showed the camera peering down into a narrow crack in the ice, the edges glistening wetly, the blue light swelling and receding like a heartbeat far below. Lamar felt the same hollow vibration in his bones as he watched, the echo of what he had felt with his own body out on the Teclanica. The hikers' voices overlapped in the recording, fear and excitement tangled together as they argued about what to do. Someone mentioned that this had to be connected to the glacier, that the Ruth was known for its deep crevasses and hidden caves, but no one could explain the light or the warmth they swore they felt on their faces when they leaned too close to the opening. The last of the early videos showed them widening the crack with ice axes, working carefully, laughing too loudly to hide their nerves. Then the files jumped forward several hours. Night had fallen, and the camera was lit by headlamps that shook in unsteady hands. The blue light was brighter now, illuminating the underside of the ice in ghostly patterns that looked almost architectural, curved lines and angles that suggested something shaped, not eroded. They talked about metal. The lens slid across a patch of exposed surface far below, and Lamar froze the frame. It was blurred but unmistakable, a straight edge catching the light in a way no stone ever would. Someone whispered that they had found bolts embedded in the ice, old ones, rusted but intact, and that there had to be a structure down there. Their breathing filled the microphone, loud and ragged, and the camera lurched as one of them slipped and was hauled back from the opening by a friend's grip on his pack. The final entries were hard to watch. The storm had come in hard and fast, burying their camp before they could break it down. The man who had started the diary spoke in short, broken phrases about how cold it was, how the ground under the tent felt wrong, like sleeping on the roof of a cave. Then there was the cut in the fabric, filmed from the inside as a desperate act, the blade tearing a ragged exit as snow poured in and the blue glow flared brighter beneath their feet. The last clip ended with the camera tumbling through a blur of white and light, the sound of shouting swallowed by a deep, resonant hum. When the screen went dark, Lamar realized he had been holding his breath. He sat back and closed his eyes, letting the heater's dry air scrape his throat raw as he tried to impose order on what he had seen. The coordinates embedded in the files placed the hikers somewhere between the Teclanica and the lower reaches of the Ruth Glacier, in a sector of the park that had always been something of a blank on official maps. He pulled those maps from the cabinet under the desk, spreading them across the tabletop, and frowned. The area was marked with little more than contour lines and a notation that read simply "No winter access." It was not the first time he had seen such omissions. There were stories among the old hands about projects from the Cold War years, when Denali had been less a sanctuary than a laboratory, its isolation a shield for experiments no one wanted on the front page. Most of those tales ended with a shrug and a warning not to chase ghosts, but as Lamar overlaid the hiker's coordinates onto the paper, he felt a shiver that had nothing to do with temperature. The blank spot sat directly beneath a ridge he knew well, a stretch of ice that had always been prone to unexplained subsidence. He called dispatch and left a clipped message about the camp and the missing hikers, omitting nothing but the blue light and the bolts. The response was sympathetic and vague, promises of a team when the weather broke, suggestions that he should not attempt anything alone. He did not argue this time. He simply ended the call and began to gather his gear again. The storm had not eased, and he knew that every instinct in his training told him to wait. But the image of that light under the ice had burned itself into his mind, a promise of warmth and shelter in a world that was otherwise all teeth. He checked his watch, scrawled a note with his intended route and the coordinates he had pulled from the flash drive, and pinned it to the corkboard above the desk. If he did not come back, At least someone would know where to look. When he stepped back outside, the wind tried to tear the door from his hand, but he forced it shut and turned his face into the storm. The world beyond the porch light was already erasing itself, the trail he had broken earlier in the evening gone as if he had never been there. He adjusted his pack, set his compass, and began to walk toward the place on the map where nothing was supposed to be. The coordinates from the flash drive led Lamar away from the last faint memory of the Stampede Trail and into terrain that even in summer felt unfinished, as though the land itself had not yet decided what shape it wanted to hold. In winter, the difference was erased entirely. Everything was slope and drift and white noise, and the only way to tell one feature from another was to listen to how the snow answered your steps. Lamar moved slowly, planting his boots with deliberate care, letting his weight settle before committing to each stride. He had learned this rhythm the hard way, after a young biologist had once vanished beneath a cornice not far from here, the snow swallowing her so cleanly that they found her months later without a mark on the surface to show where she had gone. The storm followed him like a living thing, sometimes retreating just enough to offer a hint of horizon, sometimes pressing in so tightly that he had to stop and shield his eyes to keep from stumbling blind into space. He kept his head down and his compass close, aware that the difference between forward and sideways in this kind of whiteout could be the difference between walking home and walking forever. Every few minutes, he paused to test the ground with the haft of his axe, listening to the sound it made when it struck. Most of the time, it was a solid, dull thud that told him the snowpack was thick and uniform. But more often now, he heard something else, a soft echo that lingered too long, like a knock on a hollow door. The Teklonica lay somewhere to his right, invisible under the storm, but he felt it in the way the wind twisted when it crossed the frozen basin, in the way the snow slumped a fraction of a second after he put his weight on it. The sensation he had noticed earlier had grown more insistent, a subtle tremor that did not travel through the air but through the soles of his boots and into the bones of his legs. It was as though the earth beneath him were alive and breathing in a cadence that had nothing to do with weather or ice. He was thinking about that when the crust under his left foot gave way. It happened so suddenly that there was no time to flinch. One moment he was stepping forward, the next his leg plunged into nothingness, dropping to the knee before he could catch himself. The snow collapsed around the hole with a sound like tearing cloth, and cold air rushed up from below, sharp and wet against his skin. He threw himself forward on instinct, driving the spike of his axe into the firmer drift ahead of him and sprawling onto his stomach as the ground behind him continued to settle with a sickening sigh. For several seconds he lay there, heart hammering, breath fogging the inside of his goggles, afraid to move lest the hollow expand and take him with it. When he finally dared to look back, he saw that the hole was no more than a foot wide, its edges already softening as loose snow slid inward to fill it. He reached back with his axe and prodded the opening, watching as the tool vanished into darkness far deeper than the depth of the drift. There was no bottom within reach. The vibration was stronger here, undeniable now, a steady low hum that made the handle of the axe quiver in his grip. He lay there, listening to it, the storm muted for a moment by the sudden focus of fear, and felt the cold air rising from the gap like the breath of some buried animal. Slowly, carefully, he inched away from the hole until he was on solid ground again, then sat back on his heels and let the reality of it sink in. The hikers had not simply fallen through a crevasse. They had broken into a system of spaces large enough to swallow them whole. He marked the spot with a flare flag and logged the position, though he knew the flag might be gone within the hour. Then he forced himself to continue, angling toward the ridge indicated by the coordinates on his GPS. The terrain grew more uneven as he climbed, the snow thinning in places to reveal hard blue ice beneath. And it was there that he began to see the first signs of something that did not belong to nature. Rust-colored streaks marred the ice, too straight to be mineral stains, and once he knelt to brush snow from a protrusion, only to find the curved edge of metal embedded in the glacier, its surface pitted but unmistakably manufactured. The wind faltered as he reached the lee of the ridge, the air suddenly still in a way that felt unnatural after hours of battering gusts. He followed the shelter of the slope, his breath loud in his ears, until the ground dropped away in front of him. At first, he thought he was looking at another shallow depression, but as he edged closer, the shape resolved into a narrow fissure in the ice, its sides smoothed by melt water into a glossy chute that disappeared into blue shadow. Warm air rose from the opening, faint but unmistakable, carrying with it the damp mineral scent of stone rather than the sterile bite of snow. Lamar crouched and shone his headlamp down into the crack. The beam was swallowed after a few feet, but beyond it he could see the same soft glow the hikers had filmed, a wash of color that painted the ice from below and made the walls shimmer as if lit by some submerged aurora. He hesitated only a moment before widening the opening with the pick of his axe, chipping away at the brittle lip of the fissure until there was enough room to squeeze through. Every instinct told him that going down there alone was a violation of everything he had been taught, but the alternative was to walk away from the only trace he had of the missing hikers. He anchored his rope to a stout outcrop of ice and tested the line, then swung his legs into the gap and began to lower himself into the earth. The descent was awkward, the walls close enough to scrape his pack, but the farther he went, the warmer it became. Ice gave way to stone beneath his gloves, slick with condensation, and the blue light brightened until it no longer seemed to come from a single source, but from the very fabric of the cavern around him. When his boots finally touched down on solid ground, he felt as though he had stepped into a different season, a place where winter was only a memory trapped above. He stood for a long moment at the bottom of the shaft, listening. The hum he had felt on the surface was louder here, a deep, continuous vibration that thrummed through the rock and into his chest. It was not the roar of water or the shifting of ice. It was too regular for that, too mechanical. He followed the sound along a gently sloping passage, the beam of his lamp revealing walls etched with strange patterns where the ice had once flowed and then retreated, leaving behind a cathedral of frozen waves. After perhaps 50 yards, the passage opened into a chamber large enough to swallow the patrol cabin whole. The ceiling arched overhead in a graceful curve, and its surface studded with crystalline formations that caught the blue light and scattered it in 1,000 subtle shades. And there, half buried in the far wall, was something that had no place in any cave Lamar had ever seen. It was a door. The metal was dark with age, its edges corroded where the ice had pressed against it for decades, but the outline was clear, a rectangle set into the stone with a precision that no natural process could replicate. A faded stencil clung to the surface, the last remnant of a warning or designation long since erased by time. Lamar approached it slowly, each step echoing in the vastness of the chamber, and laid his gloved hand against the cold steel. For an instant, nothing happened. Then, somewhere deep beyond the wall, a relay clicked, sharp and sudden, and a tiny green indicator flickered to life beside the handle. The mountain, it seemed, had just noticed him. The green light beside the door pulsed once and then settled into a steady glow, as if some patient mechanism deep within the mountain had merely been waiting for the warmth of a human hand. Lamar stood with his palm still against the steel, scarcely daring to breathe. The vibration that had haunted him since the surface was louder here, no longer a distant suggestion but a tangible presence that hummed through the soles of his boots and into the marrow of his bones. It was the sound of systems running, of energy being moved from one place to another in a pattern that had nothing to do with nature. He wrapped his fingers around the handle and pulled. The resistance surprised him. He had expected corrosion, a struggle, but the latch disengaged with a smooth mechanical sigh that spoke of maintenance rather than abandonment. The door swung inward on hinges that protested faintly, revealing a narrow corridor beyond, its walls lined with cables and ducts half hidden beneath a fur of frost. The air inside was warmer still, hovering just above freezing, and it carried a smell that set his nerves on edge. It was the scent of old machinery, oil and dust, and something faintly electrical, a perfume he had not encountered since his childhood when he used to explore derelict buildings in the dying industrial towns his father moved them through. It did not belong under a glacier. The corridor sloped gently downward, lit at intervals by recessed lamps that flickered as he passed, startled perhaps by the sudden demand on circuits that had not felt a human presence in years. He advanced slowly, touching the walls with his gloved hand, feeling the vibration grow stronger as he descended. Every few yards he paused to listen, expecting at any moment to hear the groan of shifting ice or the thunder of collapse, but the structure around him held firm, its geometry too precise to be the product of chance. He emerged into a larger space that had once been a control room. Consoles lined the walls in a horseshoe pattern, their surfaces dulled by a film of condensation and frost. Some of the indicator lights were dark, but others glowed faintly, stubbornly alive, painting the room in a palette of tired greens and ambers. On one panel, a gauge needle twitched back and forth in a narrow range, marking the pulse he had been feeling in his bones since he left the surface. Lamar moved from station to station, reading labels that had been etched or stenciled in a hand that belonged to another century. Most were too faded to decipher, but a few stood out, references to power distribution, to thermal management, to communications arrays that had once pointed outward from this hidden heart of Denali toward a world that no longer existed. It did not take much imagination to reconstruct the story. During the height of the Cold War, someone had decided that the best way to watch the sky was from beneath the ice, that the park's isolation would shield their eyes and ears from prying satellites. The idea must have seemed elegant at the time, a fortress buried in the most impenetrable landscape on the continent. He found a filing cabinet against the far wall and tugged at its drawers until one slid free with a shriek of protest. Inside were folders warped by damp, their contents yellowed and brittle. He skimmed what he could, his headlamp illuminating fragments of plans and memoranda that sketched out the birth and sudden death of the facility. The dates clustered around the early 1960s, the language shifting abruptly from optimistic projections to terse evacuation notices. One document ended in mid-sentence, the ink trailing off the page as if its author had been interrupted. There was no single explanation for the abandonment, only a pattern of haste that suggested something had gone wrong quickly and badly. He imagined technicians racing these same corridors decades ago, carrying what they could, sealing doors behind them in a ritual of retreat that had left this place to fend for itself under the inexorable pressure of the ice. That it had survived at all was a testament to the engineering of people who had believed, perhaps arrogantly, that they could make something permanent in a landscape that devoured the permanent as a matter of course. The farther he explored, the more signs of life he found. The main generator room was quiet, its great turbines locked in place beneath a crust of rime, but auxiliary units hummed softly in a side chamber, their housings warm to the touch. Pipes ran along the ceiling, insulated and insulated again, carrying heat drawn from some deeper source that he could not yet see. It was that heat, he realized, that had hollowed out the mountain, melting channels through the ice that had grown over the years into the vast, hidden caverns he had walked through. He followed the warmth down another passage that curved away from the control center and into a section where the walls shifted from metal to stone. The ice here was thinner, its blue translucence replaced by bare rock slick with moisture, and it was in this hybrid space between base and cave that he found the first real sign of the missing hikers. A coil of climbing rope lay neatly against the wall, its fibers stiff with frost. Beside it, someone had stacked 3 sleeping pads and a bundle of thermal blankets, arranged with the deliberate care of people who intended to stay. A crude arrow had been scratched into the stone above the pile, pointing deeper into the complex. Next to it, in block letters that were already beginning to blur as meltwater traced their edges, someone had written a single word: warm. Lamar crouched there for a long moment, his pack resting against his knees, the weight of what he had uncovered pressing in on him from every direction. The hikers had not died in the snowstorm. They had found this place and chosen to move forward rather than back, drawn by the same impossible promise of shelter that had pulled him down through the ice. The base had not merely survived, it had become a refuge. The vibration changed as he moved beyond the improvised camp, deepening into a more complex cadence that suggested multiple systems working in concert. He passed through a series of chambers that bore the marks of human adaptation. Tarps hung to create smaller rooms, cooking equipment arranged around a vent that exhaled steady warmth, water dripping into a collection of scavenged containers from a pipe that had been coaxed back into service. This was no longer an abandoned installation. It was a living place, shaped by hands that had no intention of letting it die. Somewhere ahead of him a voice murmured, too distant to make out words, but unmistakably human. Lamar froze, the beam of his headlamp trembling as his heart surged against his ribs. He had come this far, prepared to confront relics and ghosts, but the presence of real people, breathing and speaking under the ice, brought a new and urgent gravity to his mission. He had crossed a threshold from rescue to revelation, and he had no idea which side of it he was supposed to stand on. The murmur Lamar had heard resolved into the scrape of boots on stone and the soft clatter of something being set down carefully, the ordinary domestic noises of people who had lived too long in places that were never meant to feel like home. He extinguished his headlamp and stood in the blue glow that seeped through the cavern like light filtered through deep water. It was easier on the eyes this way, and less likely to announce his presence too abruptly. He advanced with measured steps, every sense straining for cues, until the passage widened again and the smell of wood smoke reached him, so faint it might have been imagined, yet unmistakable once he recognized it. The corridor ended in a space that had once been a storage bay, its metal ribs still arched overhead, but the walls were now softened by layers of ice that had retreated and returned over the decades, carving out alcoves and niches where people had made themselves small shelters from tarps and scavenged panels. Strings of low-voltage lights traced the edges of the room, their glow fed by cables that ran back into the deeper machinery of the base. In the center, a cluster of figures gathered around a makeshift stove assembled from parts Lamar could not identify, its venting tied into an old duct that carried the smoke away with quiet efficiency. He had time to take in these details before anyone noticed him. Then a woman looked up from the pot she was stirring, her eyes widening as the light caught the reflective strip on his parka. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The silence that fell was heavier than any storm he had walked through, charged with the same raw instinct that had driven the hikers to cut their way out of a tent, rather than face another night on the ice. "I'm a ranger," Lamar said softly, raising his hands so they could see them. His voice sounded too loud in the enclosed space, a stranger's sound in a world that had learned to whisper. "I'm here because people are missing. I think you know who I mean." A man stepped forward, taller than the others, his beard matted with frost despite the warmth of the cavern. He held a length of pipe in his hand, not quite a weapon, but close enough to be one if he needed it to be. Lamar met his gaze and did not look away. After a long moment, the man lowered the pipe and gestured for him to keep his voice down. "You shouldn't be here," the man said. His tone was not hostile so much as weary, as if he had been waiting years for this moment and dreading it every day. No one should. They led Lamar through a maze of interconnected chambers, past rooms that had once housed equipment and now held bunk beds fashioned from scrap, tables scarred by the use of too many hands, shelves lined with jars of melted snow filtered through layers of cloth and charcoal. Everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of ingenuity born of necessity. Old vents had been repurposed as greenhouses, their residual warmth coaxing pale shoots of greens from trays of soil hauled down from the surface in backpacks over countless dangerous trips. A battered laptop glowed in one corner, and its screen alive with lines of code that monitored the ancient systems that kept the place habitable. In a quieter alcove, a small group sat around a terminal that had been coaxed back to life. A portable battery was plugged into its side, and on the screen flickered the familiar interface of a video player. Lamar recognized the face that appeared there immediately, the same young man who had introduced himself on the flash drive with so much misplaced confidence. The image froze on his hollowed eyes and chapped lips, his expression caught between fear and resolve. "That's the last thing he recorded," the tall man said, "before he decided to stay." They watched the clip together in silence. The hiker spoke in a whisper, explaining that they had been rescued by people who lived under the ice, people who had nowhere else to go. He talked about the warmth, the food, the way the base felt like a second chance in a world that had taken too many first ones away. He ended by saying that they had been given a choice: to go back up and face whatever had driven them into the wilderness in the first place, or to remain where the mountain itself seemed willing to shelter them. He said he was staying. When the screen went dark, Lamar turned back to the group. Their faces were different ages and colors, their clothes a patchwork of brands and decades, but they all wore the same expression of guarded expectation. He understood then that this was not a temporary refuge, but a community, one that had grown slowly, accreting the lost and the desperate, like silt in a riverbed. They told him their story in fragments, each voice adding a piece to the whole. It had begun with a man who fell through a weak spot in the ice more than a decade earlier, breaking his leg and expecting to die in the dark. Instead, he had found warmth and the echo of machinery still beating in the heart of the mountain. He had crawled deeper, discovered the abandoned base, and survived long enough to heal. When he finally returned to the surface, he had done so only to bring back supplies and, eventually, others who had slipped through the cracks of the world above. Some had been homeless in Anchorage, drifting through shelters that closed their doors in winter. Some had been veterans who could not sleep without the ceiling pressing close. Some were simply tired of losing ground to a society that had no patience for those who moved too slowly. The base had become their secret, a place to disappear into when the cold grew too sharp and the nights too long. "And the hikers?" Lamar asked when they finished. The tall man shrugged. "They were half dead when we found them. Frostbite, exhaustion. We could have carried them back up, maybe. But they saw what we have here. They asked to stay." The idea unsettled him more than he expected. In the eyes of the Park Service, these people were squatters in a protected area, trespassers in a place that belonged to everyone and no one at once. Yet, standing there in the blue-lit caverns, listening to the hum of systems that had outlived their creators, he could not bring himself to see them as criminals. They were survivors, adapting to a world that had turned its back on them. Still, the dangers were real. He felt them in the tremor of the walls, heard them in the way the old machinery coughed and shuddered under loads it had not been designed to bear for so long. He imagined the ice shifting above them, the slow, relentless pressure of the glacier grinding against rock and steel alike, and saw in his mind a future where this hidden city collapsed without warning, entombing everyone inside. "You can't stay here forever," he said quietly. "This place isn't stable. The base is old. The ice is moving. If it comes down, no one will even know where to look." The tall man met his gaze again, and this time there was something like relief in his eyes. "We know," he said. "We hear it every day. The mountain reminding us that we're on borrowed time. But up there isn't any safer for us. Up there, we're invisible. Down here, at least, we exist." The hikers joined the circle then, stepping out from the deeper shadows with expressions that mingled hope and fear. They spoke of debts, of families they had lost, of mistakes that had led them to the Stampede Trail in the first place. None of them wanted to be rescued if rescue meant being returned to the same conditions that had driven them into the storm. They asked Lamar not to report what he had found, not to mark the entrance, not to turn this fragile miracle into another red tag on a locked gate. He felt the weight of their request settle on him like fresh snow. Every rule he had ever learned told him what he was supposed to do next. Call for backup, secure the site, begin evacuation. Yet the rules had not been written with places like this in mind, with communities that existed only because the world had failed them too many times. Lamar left them to their dinner and walked alone to the edge of the chamber where the natural rock met the man-made corridors. He pressed his palm against the stone and felt the vibration again, steady and deep, the heartbeat of a mountain that had become a shelter by accident and by stubborn human will. He knew then that whatever choice he made when he returned to the surface would shape not only his own life, but the fate of everyone who lived in this hidden world beneath Denali. Lamar spent the night in a narrow alcove at the edge of the underground settlement, lying on a thin mattress that had once been a section of thermal insulation. Sleep came only in fragments. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the slow tremor of the base through the stone, the same vibration that had followed him since the Teclanica, now no longer a mystery but a warning that pulsed steadily in his chest. The mountain was never silent here. It breathed, groaned, whispered in frequencies that human ears were never meant to interpret, and in those sounds Lamar heard both protection and threat, a cradle that could become a coffin without the slightest change in intent. When he rose, the people of the hidden city were already awake. Some were tending the pale green shoots in their improvised greenhouse, coaxing life from soil that had been carried down in backpacks over years of perilous climbs. Others were clustered around the machinery bays, checking gauges, listening to the old systems with the practiced attention of those who knew that a single unnoticed failure could end everything. The hikers were among them now, no longer visitors but participants, their faces no less strained but altered by a cautious sense of belonging. The tall man who had first confronted Lamar found him near the junction where the base gave way to raw cavern. He introduced himself as Everett and spoke without preamble, his voice low so it would not carry through the tunnels. He said that the community had lived with the fear of discovery since the beginning, that every winter storm was both a shield and a threat, hiding them from the world while at the same time reminding them how thin the barrier was between survival and extinction. He said that Lamar's arrival changed everything, because now the secret was no longer just theirs. Lamar listened and said little. He walked the corridors with Everett and saw things he had missed the night before. Cracks spidering across load-bearing supports where the glacier's pressure had shifted the geometry of the base. Condensation pooling in places where the insulation had thinned, a sign that the thermal balance was beginning to fail. A section of ceiling where the ice had recently sagged enough to shear a conduit, its copper interior exposed like a nerve. These were not the problems of a place that could simply be left to endure. He gathered the hikers and the older members of the settlement in what had once been a briefing room, its walls still bearing faded insignia beneath layers of frost. They stood in a loose circle, the blue glow painting their faces in the same muted palette, erasing the differences that might have mattered anywhere else. Lamar told them what he had seen. He did not soften the truth. He said the base was deteriorating, that the glacier was moving in ways no one could fully predict, that the systems keeping the caverns warm were ancient and had been running far longer than anyone who built them would have thought possible. He said that if there was a collapse, it would not announce itself. It would simply happen, and no one on the surface would even know where to dig. Some of them argued. They had heard warnings before, had lived with the creak of the mountain long enough that it had become part of their rhythm. Others stared at the floor, the weight of his words pressing down on hopes that had been fragile from the start. The hikers spoke last. They said they understood the risk but that they were not ready to go back, that whatever waited for them above the ice felt more dangerous than anything the mountain could do. They asked him again not to betray them, to let this place remain the invisible refuge it had become. Lamar felt the old familiar ache of duty settle in his chest, the same ache that had drawn him north years ago when he had decided that the only way to live with the choices he had made was to place himself in a world governed by rules larger than regret. Those rules were clear. A hidden settlement in a national park was not just illegal, it was a liability that could not be ignored. His radio, hanging silent from his belt, was a link to an authority that would descend on this place with helicopters and engineers, sealing tunnels, evacuating people who did not want to be saved, turning a living secret into a report and a warning sign. But he had also seen the faces of those people, the way they had shaped their lives around the rhythms of the base, the small rituals that made this impossible place feel like home. He had heard the desperation in the hikers' voices when they spoke of the world they had fled, and he had felt the mountain's tremor, the promise of warmth that had drawn all of them down through the ice in the first place. The decision came to him not as a revelation, but as an acceptance of something he had known since he had first knelt beside the broken tent. There was no outcome here that did not involve loss. The question was only whose loss he was willing to live with. He told them he would not transmit the exact coordinates of the entrance. The relief in the room was immediate and almost painful to witness, but he did not leave it there. He said he would also not pretend this place was safe. He proposed a compromise that satisfied no one completely but offered a thread of hope. He would return to the surface and report that the hikers had been found in a natural cave system beneath the Ruth Glacier, omitting the existence of the base itself. He would begin the process of arranging discrete resupply drops in the general area under the guise of geological monitoring, enough to help them reinforce the most vulnerable sections and stockpile essentials for the worst of the winter. And he would help anyone who wanted to leave find a way out, no questions asked, no reports filed that would lead anyone back here. Everett studied him for a long time before nodding. The hikers looked between each other, weighing a future that was no longer a binary choice between staying and dying. It was not the rescue Lamar had been trained to deliver, but it was the only kind that made sense in a place that defied training. He prepared to leave as the artificial day cycle of the base dimmed the lights to simulate night. Everett walked him back to the chamber where the metal door waited, the same door that had woken after decades of sleep at his touch. Before Lamar stepped through, Everett pressed something into his hand, a small round token cut from the casing of an old instrument, its surface etched with a pattern that echoed the crystalline shapes of the caverns beyond. It was a piece of the base, he said, a reminder that what lived under the ice was real, not a story to be filed away. The climb back to the surface was harder than the descent. The warmth faded with every meter, replaced by the sharp, clean brutality of winter. When Lamar finally emerged onto the Tiklanika flats, the storm had eased, leaving the world hushed beneath a blanket of fresh snow that concealed every trace of what lay below. He stood for a long moment, breathing air that felt suddenly too thin, and looked out across the endless white. He reached into his pack and removed the GPS, scrolling through the saved waypoints until he found the one that marked the fissure. His thumb hovered over the delete command. For an instant, he imagined the sound of rotor blades, the flood of light, the way this quiet plane would be transformed by the machinery of revelation. Then he pressed the button and watched the coordinates vanish. The mountain did not react. It did not thank him or warn him or make any sign that it had registered his choice. It simply continued to breathe beneath the ice, a patient, hidden heart beating out a rhythm older than rules and stronger than fear. Lamar tucked the small metal token into his pocket and turned back towards the distant glow of the patrol cabin, carrying with him the knowledge that beneath Denali there was a second world now, one that depended not on maps or commands, but on the fragile, unrecorded decisions of a single man walking away from the only proof it had ever had. If this hidden world beneath the ice shocked you, don't stop here. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next story, watch the other videos on the channel, and share this one with someone who loves mystery.